In my last video, we had talked about AK and his recent end-of-season press conference and the need for change to this roster, or at least a step in the right direction from Arturas Karnisovas, and actually admitting that this roster does not work, that he recognizes the need for change, and that time is now. And while words are good and well, it doesn't really mean much unless it's actioned upon, because we've heard this from AK in various statements made throughout his tenure, and nothing has really come of it as far as building a contender, not settling for mediocrity, changing the Bulls' shooting profile, playing faster, all of that. But while we can be encouraged that this was a more emphatic need to make concrete changes to this team given the poor results over the last 3 years, and the front office may in fact want to make drastic changes, doing it on the other hand is easier said than done. Making changes to this team isn't going to be easy as just trading away some of your unwanted players or blowing up the roster and starting fresh. And I mentioned some of this in my last video, but spoke to it more briefly in terms of what the Bulls are going to be going up against. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down the Bulls salary cap situation, projections for how much certain free agents might command, trades that could be made, and of course what quote-unquote change really looks like. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now real quick, we got a special offer from Underdog Fantasy, the sponsor of this channel. If you're not already familiar with Underdog, let me tell you about the app real quick. My personal favorite that I use on the app, NBA Pick'ems. With Pick'ems, you can pick higher or lower on most player stats and win money based on the ones you get right. You pick higher or lower and you can win up to 20 times your money in a single night if you do 5 Pick'ems and you get them all right. They've also just opened up in Florida, so if you live in that area, that's now an option for you. Again, use the code BullsCentral to get your first deposit doubled. Link to the site and the code is in the description and pinned comment. Now, I think there is one thing to call out from AK and his end-of-season press conference that I didn't mention before, and it's important because I see a lot of people saying that, well, change means they're going to tear this whole thing down and just start rebuilding. They're going to accept being bad for a while and build through the draft with Coby and Io. But one thing I think a lot of people missed from AK's comments is he said his goal, well, first and foremost, is to win, but even further adding and talking about next season and how he wants to see this team win 10 more games. In other words, he wants to be a 50-win team in the NBA. Now, what I take away from that comment is that they're not going to start tanking. They're not going to go through a couple of years of losing to take a step back to be more successful for the future. No, his goal is to still try and put together a winning and competitive team. Now, we can argue all day whether or not that's the right approach given what we know about this team, but if we're going to take AK at his word, while he said everything is on the table, which you think potentially means also tearing it down, but at his word, he wants this team to still try and win 10 more games than last season. And look, if that's the case, there is really only one way to enact change based on the situation the Bulls find themselves in, and that's to ship out picks for already established players. Something the Bulls already tried to do and it backfired, sending out 2 first-round picks for Vucevic and 1 first-round pick in the sign and trade for DeMar DeRozan. Now, to be clear, the Bulls aren't able to send out any of their first-round picks until 2027, as they already owe their pick in 25 to the Spurs, which is top 10 protected. And because of the staffing rule not being able to trade consecutive first-round draft picks, the soonest first-round pick they can trade is in 2027. And that, of course, means they can trade picks through 2031, as you can only trade picks 7 years out into the future as long as you're below the first tax apron, which the Bulls are. So you can think about it in the sense that the Bulls can trade up to 3 first-round picks if they really wanted to by sending out picks from 27, 29, and 31. Now, there has been recent rumblings coming out of ESPN from Jamal Collier that players like Donovan Mitchell, Trae Young, Paul George are on the Bulls' radar as far as upgrading their overall roster and using their draft capital to be able to acquire one of these guys. I'm not going to delve into that too much further because, one, I think it's incredibly unrealistic to think that the Bulls would actually have a means to be able to get one of these guys because they don't have the requisite draft capital and salary components to make a deal work. And 2, I really don't think adding one of these guys makes the Bulls that much better to whether or not a top 4 or top 5 team in the East and winning close to 50 games. And at that point, it's not worth throwing over 2 or 3 first-round picks to be able to get them. But calling it out because there are rumors that the Bulls are going star shopping going into the offseason as part of their goal of implementing change. But what I want to focus more here is the Bulls' current roster and their cap sheet, because in order for them to make big changes, a lot of it is going to be predicated on what they do with DeMar DeRozan's impending free agency. So as I'm sure you all know, DeMar is set to become an unrestricted free agent July 1st. The Bulls have the ability to offer him an extension prior to that date to retain him before hitting free agency. But it's also important to note that Casey Johnson of NBC Sports Chicago reported that it's believed the Bulls offered DeMar $40 million a year for 2 years, and DeMar and his camp turned it down because they're looking for a longer-term deal. Now, we don't know whether or not DeMar was offered that amount or if there were any caveats to it being a team option in the second year, but I do trust Casey's reporting more than most Bulls insiders. And if that is in fact the case, and the Bulls are willing to offer that kind of deal or something in that range of $40 million, then the Bulls are in bad shape as far as enacting meaningful change to this roster. And here's why. The Bulls, as of right now, have $128 million committed in salary going into next season. That does not include potential extensions for DeMar, Patrick Williams, Andre Drummond, as well as their projected first-round lottery pick. The salary cap going into next season is only $141 million, and the tax line is set at $172 million. The Bulls, what they have committed in guaranteed salary only keeps them $13 million below the cap and $44 million below the tax line. And for all intents and purposes, as we've said numerous times on this channel, the tax line you can view as a hard cap for the Chicago Bulls. They're not going over that line. They've paid the luxury tax once in the last 40 years. They're not going to suddenly do it now for a team that can't even make the playoffs. So the Bulls have $44 million in quote-unquote space, if you will, for next season with 3 open roster spots. Now the Bulls have a first-round lottery pick, which is going to be roughly $7 million based on where the pick is projected to go at number 11. Obviously, it'll be much more if they get lucky and move up into the top 4, but for now, we'll assume they'll land the number 11 pick, which would put the cap figure just a tad under $135 million, which would only leave about $37 million with 2 open roster spots. Already, paying DeMar DeRozan in the range of $40 million puts them over the tax line at that point, even without paying Patrick Williams, and also assumes they let Andre Drummond walk. So giving DeMar something in the range of $40 million is almost an impossibility at this point. And it's why, if this report is true and the Bulls were looking to offer DeMar that much, tells me that they probably aren't going to enact too much change unless, of course, they move off from Zach Lavine and try and take back less salary in the form of a trade, which of course they can only take back so much less in salary in order for the trade to be legal. But they can take less salary back, which any dollar amount helps the Bulls in staying under the tax. And it's also possible they could package Zach in a deal and another player, say Alex Caruso, which could enable them to take back even less money. But we'll save that for the moment. But it's one avenue of creating change within this roster is trading Zach Lavine. And then, of course, getting Lonzo Ball's salary off the books the final year of his deal to the tune of $21.3 million, which they could wipe out if they're able to deem his injury career ending. But outside of that, outside of trading Zach Lavine and taking back less salary and getting Lonzo's deal wiped off the books, there isn't much the Bulls can do from a cap relief standpoint. Yeah, maybe they let Andre Drummond walk, but he's making only $3.3 million. Maybe Torrey Craig declines his player option and leaves, but he was on a min deal at $2.8 million. That doesn't move the needle for the Bulls. Maybe they can get Pat on a lesser deal. His qualifying offer is $12.9 million, which isn't small. Like, that's a big cut into the overall cap at the qualifying offer. Sure, they could maybe get him for slightly less than $12.9 annually if they strike a longer term deal at a lower annual rate, but I doubt that Pat goes for that. He's going to prefer to take the qualifying offer, bet on himself, and try and get a bag the following season, one that doesn't end in a season-ending injury. So let's say for a moment, we're going to be conservative here. The Bulls let Andre Drummond walk. Torrey Craig declines his player option and leaves. Let's even say for the moment they're able to clear Lonzo's $21 million salary. That would put them at roughly $110 million in guaranteed salary going into next season. Let's say Pat takes the qualifying offer and then they give DeMar $40 million. That would land them at $162.9 million with 3 open roster spots since they wouldn't be bringing back Drummond, Craig, and Lonzo Ball. 3 open roster spots while only having around $9 million to spend and using the mid-level exception or the biannual exception. So you're talking about minimum level deals for 3 spots to try and remain under the tax line. That's not moving the needle if you're the Bulls. You're more or less running it back. Like, as much as it seems like getting Lonzo's deal off the books is a big relief from a cap perspective, it's not when you see all the committed salary on the books that already puts the Bulls over the cap and they only have the mid-level exception to sign other free agents. That's why trading Zach Lavine is imperative. And as Casey Johnson mentioned on the Bulls Talk podcast, that remains a focal point for the organization for this offseason. Because trading Zach, one, enables the Bulls short-term relief from a cap perspective going into this season and gives them more flexibility, especially if they're able to get Lonzo's deal off. But more importantly, if they're able to trade him for expiring contracts, it frees up their books for the long term. My only question is, are they going to be able to trade Zach? We already saw the challenges with that last season, and there not being a market for him. Teams unwilling to take on his contract and unsure of his health status. With Zach being out for most of the season, not having a good season when he was playing, the Bulls for the most part looking better without him, teams are not going to be chomping at the bit to trade for this guy. Now, I do think there could be some potential suitors, and I'll have a video out at some point on what some of those potential trades and teams could look like. Teams like the Warriors, Kings, the Magic, maybe interest from the Pistons will rise again. So I'm not saying that it's going to be impossible for the Bulls to try and move on from Zach Lavine, but I think the Bulls are going to run into the same challenges they found themselves in last season when they were looking to move him. The market or lack of market for Zach isn't going to change much. If anything, it's likely gotten worse with him being a year older now and coming off a major injury. So then back to DeMar for a second, because that's kind of the key piece here as far as it relates to putting meaningful change to this roster. I just don't see how you bring DeMar back on a salary that's more than $30 million a year. Like, if you can get DeMar for around the same level of money that he's making right now, maybe $28 million, and on a short-term deal, okay, that provides you more flexibility, especially if you remove Lonzo's salary. Enough where you can use the full mid-level exception, which I believe is around $13 million for this upcoming season. But again, is that meaningful change? You still have DeMar. You're still bringing back Vucevic, which I know I didn't touch on him, but I don't see a scenario in which the Bulls are actually going to be able to trade Vuce unless it's for salary dumping purposes. So you're likely seeing Vucevic return. Patrick Williams gets re-signed. You're keeping everyone else on the roster while bringing in some free agents on mid-level or minimum deals, which are going to be role players. Is that really the type of change the Bulls need to make this team better? Maybe marginally better? So yeah, as much as we would like to see big changes to this team and the front office actually being serious about making concrete changes, it's going to be more difficult than you think, especially if the ultimate goal is to try and keep winning. I would love to hear what you guys think though. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.